Um, Again, I'm Pete Peterson, Dean here at the Policy School, and this is our last part of the conference. I wanted to end it a little bit differently in both format and content. The subtitle, as we talked about, the title of this conference was Challenges and Opportunities Through Institutions. And so I wanted to conclude on an up note with opportunities through institutions. This last panel talked about some of the new institutions that are being built and created in defense of free speech and free inquiry. And I'm delighted to be joined here by the founder and president director of another one of those, FAIR, which is an acronym for the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. Please join me in welcoming Bion Bartning. So Bion, just as a place to start, and by way of your introduction, why you and why FAIR?
So I am not an activist, I guess, is what I'm going to start with, and I think that's actually important. I think we need more people who are not activists who are involved in this. I'm a father. I have two children, and they were happily going to a private school in New York City, and I think even prior to George Floyd, we were starting to see some encroachment of, I think, what Robbie George described as the liberation ideology, I think, starting to arrive at the school, just in terms of how sex ed was being covered in kindergarten. Our children were introduced to, to basic sex ed concepts that it just felt very early, but we're a relatively liberal family. Mm-hmm. We weren't incredibly offended, but we found it strange that our daughter was coming home with a new vocabulary, including the word vulva, which I just felt was a little young for her to be learning that. But really it was post George Floyd that things really went off the rails, and I think that we were not alone. I think this was happening in a lot of schools, but I think the groundwork was laid well before George Floyd. But I think post George Floyd, I think a lot of the school administrators became emboldened to just become much more overt about what they were focused on. So what we saw is that the school rolled out just a very different approach than I was comfortable with toward race. And for me, it was personal. I'm mixed race myself. So my father is Mexican and Yaqui. My mother is Ashkenazi Jewish. And I grew up really feeling like that made me a pretty normal American. I think that's I think we're all mixed in some way. I think that's what's amazing about this country. And and it struck me as odd that the school was approaching that issue in a way that was incredibly flattening and ultimately, I think, dehumanizing, because the school was insisting that children identify based on the color of their skin, through forming affinity groups, which were focused on exclusively skin color. So to me, it felt reminiscent of the Sneetches, the Dr. Seuss book, where you have the star belly Sneetches and the plain belly Sneetches. And it just seemed like this ideology had come into play that was dividing people. And so I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal called "Dividing by Race Comes to Grade School." And, and I think that was really the start of launching FAIR.
So again, you would not classify yourself as an activist. Talk a little bit more about what it took to move you into this. I mean, what had previously kind of been your day job and area of interest, and talk a little bit more about that transition from someone who is a parent, politically maybe more on the left, was seeing your kids coming home with new vocabulary, as you say, to understand that I can't leave it for someone else to do, that you kind of saw it as something that you had to just talk about that transition.
I think so. As I became aware of what was happening at my kids' school, and I started trying to I figured I was not the only person who had a concern about this.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started looking at other institutions that you would think you could rely on, including the ACLU, civil rights organizations, really any institution, what I started to see is that what was happening at Riverdale Country School was really happening everywhere, and so I saw that the institutions that I should have been able to rely on, I could not rely on. I found it very difficult to find information on what was happening. I think the news really didn't have a lot of information. I found some YouTube videos. I think I came across John McWhorter early on. And then there was an article that Barry Weiss had published in Tablet called Stop Being Shocked that really spoke to me. And I think that at that time I connected with I connected with Barry, I connected with Melissa Chen, I connected with people who I think had been talking about these issues for years. And what I saw is that there were no institutions that were really standing up for the values that I cared about. And my background is launching new businesses. On the for-profit side, I have no nonprofit experience, but it seemed to me like my experience, my skills could be helpful, and I could think of no more important thing for me to focus on as a father and somebody who cares passionately about these issues than launching a new organization. So I told my wife I'm going to take 6 months to focus on this, and she was petrified. I will say, I mean, she was petrified about me writing the op-ed. I think there was it was a time. I think more people are speaking out now, but this was, I guess, 15 months ago, and I think there was a real concern on her part that for some reason I didn't have. I knew that speaking out was the right thing to do, and ultimately she was incredibly supportive of what I was doing.
So you write the op-ed, talk about the response to that and how that then moved to the next point. Were you thinking about FAIR at the time you were writing the op-ed? Was that kind of a possibility out there?
It was. So yes, it was. And let's see, I started writing the op-ed, I would say in November of 2020. And I published the op-ed in March of 2021. And I think a lot of that journey was getting my wife comfortable with me speaking out. So it was really 4 months of getting her comfortable. And I think the hard part was that the Wall Street Journal insisted that we name the school. And in the world of independent schools, there is one thing you are not supposed to do, which is to name the institution. And so I think her concern was that we would become untouchable, and that if I spoke out and I named the school, that would end up following us.
And specifically, I would guess you're in some social circles that are connected to the school. Talk a bit about how that fed into your considerations.
Yeah, no, I think we have people who were friends who have not spoken with me since publishing the op-ed. I think that there is a lot of social pressure. I think there's a lot of fear that people have. But at the same time, there were people who I did not know who came and thanked me for speaking up. I think the school has changed its approach somewhat. I mean, we pulled our children from the school. We've actually moved to Miami, and our kids are in a Jewish day school now. So we took some fairly drastic steps. I think the school. What I understand is that
Just to be clear, not to interrupt, but do you think that? Did you think that was a possibility when you started down this road, that you were going to have to leave New York and pull your kids out of the school that they were in? Talk about
it. Never. I think that when the school first rolled out this new curriculum, this new approach, I did not understand that this is what was happening throughout our culture, and I do think this is a cultural issue. This is not a political issue, and that's why I don't think there's a political solution. I think there's a cultural solution here. But at that time, we had invested so much in that institution. Our daughter had enrolled there in pre-K, and we were looking forward to her staying through 12th grade. I think that it was really I think that was part of the journey and why it took 4 months, because I think my wife was right. She knew that when we published the op-ed, that meant that we were leaving the school because we would not be welcome in that institution anymore. So I think it was a very difficult, challenging moment, and to uproot your life in that way is huge. I will say we are incredibly grateful for having made that decision.
So you want me to believe that your wife was more farsighted than you were? Is that what you're trying to say about the possibilities of ramifications of decisions?
She probably thought it through more than I did. Yes.
So the piece gets published, and again, without any nonprofit experience, leadership experience, although certainly private sector experience and experience with launching new things, FAIR becomes a reality. And so, again, doesn't seem to be a natural next step for most people, especially if they don't have that kind of experience in the nonprofit space, that the fact that you wanted to create an actual institution as opposed to continuing to write your pieces. I mean, I think about Barry Weiss, right? I mean, she's become a great platform. She wrote that incredible piece on Harvard Westlake here, which is telling, I'm sure, a very similar story to what you're talking about, but also has created a platform for others to tell these stories about their own experiences, specifically in the education realm. But she hasn't taken that step of creating this nonprofit entity. Tell us a little bit about your thinking about why creating an institution was something you thought was necessary.
So I think there are. I am not of the mind that we need to abandon our institutions. So let me just be clear. I think that University of Austin, I think, is great. I think we need new institutions, but we cannot abandon our existing institutions. That is not the solution. I do think when it comes to civil rights, civil liberties, we needed a new institution, and I think we need more than one new institution. So, because I think the ACLU is not standing up for individual civil rights and civil liberties. It's actually the legal arm of this new ideology. So, so I do think that in some instances we need new institutions, and I think that it's important for us to identify those needs and to launch these new institutions. So for me, it was obvious that we need not just individuals speaking out. I think that's important, but we need institutional support as well. And so, the focus of FAIR is on informing people. So there's a whole set of content that we're producing, but also empowering people. So we have a grassroots chapter network. We have over 100 chapters and tens of thousands of people involved, but also advocating for people. So we have a legal network as well. So we're able to support people. So when they need help, when they identify these issues within their institution, because I think when you're outside, right now I'm in Miami, and Miami, this feels very distant. Right, it feels very distant. But when you're in an institution and you see this illiberal ideology take hold, any sort of illiberal ideology, I think you are desperate for help, and it's very difficult to extract yourself from that situation. I mean, what I did was fairly radical to uproot my family and move to a different state, because we realized we really couldn't find a school in New York City that would meet our needs. But I think that most people can't do that on their own, and so I think we need institutions that will advocate for people.
Neil Ferguson had written a piece a couple of years ago calling for a NATO approach as opposed to the heterodox academy approach. And I know that Neil is affiliated with the work that you're all doing. And obviously that NATO approach being that an attack on one is an attack on all. But for that to have any sort of credibility as a sense of security, that all better be pretty significant. And so talk a bit about how you pulled together this group of people that were committed to these principles. And maybe just again, because I'm just very interested in how somebody creates something like this who's not coming from an activist background, albeit from a startup background. Was that part of the plan as well? They said, I need to get some leading thinkers here to create this sense that we have some top scholars and activists, policymakers, artists that are with us here.
Definitely. I mean, I think what I saw is a lot of independent voices that were speaking out on these issues, and so the first thought that I had is, if we could bring people together under a common umbrella, then maybe we can accomplish more together. So I think that was definitely part of the thinking, was to do what I think the Harpers Letter and other initiatives had tried to do.
Talk a bit about that for those. It was referenced earlier, but the Harpers Letter, and how did that feed into your thinking about really what the state of play was?
So the Harpers Letter was a letter published, when was it, in 2020, right? Yeah, it was in 2020. That was a group of prominent public figures who were speaking out about just the cancel culture, the issues we're talking about today. And they were mostly coming, I would say, from a left of center viewpoint, and I don't know that I think it got people to talk, but it was a letter. It didn't, there was no institutional follow through, right? And I think there was a little controversy, because I think at least one of the people who signed the letter ended up pulling their name from it once they started getting flack. So the idea was, let's have an actual institution as opposed to just a one-off message. And I think part of this is based on the premise that it's a lot easier to be a culture critic than it is to be a creator. And I think that, what we wanted to do is actually create an institution that's going to stand up for these values, because we can't rely on the ACLU, we can't rely on many of the existing institutions. I think in particular, in addition to obviously our higher education system, I think the state of our nonprofit sector is, probably even worse. I think that these illiberal ideologies have really captured, much of the nonprofit sector as well.
I was going to go someplace else, but let's drill down on this. We've obviously, in the last panel, talked about academia and the challenges there. For those who may not be familiar with the power, scope, and reach of what you just called the nonprofit sector, talk a bit about what kinds of, we mentioned the ACLU before, but that's obviously at least in mission is ostensibly geared towards these issues around civil rights, whether they're doing that now anymore. But what kinds of nonprofit organizations are you talking about that may not have in their mission this commitment to civil rights and free speech?
Well, I mean, so obviously ACLU is a $300 million organization, and I think that I won't say that everything the ACLU is doing is working against liberal values,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that they have definitely become more of a partisan activist institution as opposed to an institution that's and standing up for group outcomes as opposed to individual rights. I think that's really been the shift of the ACLU. But within the nonprofit sector, and I think in particular this really accelerated post George Floyd, there has been a politicization of everything, and
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of the foundations that are giving grants are requiring that individual nonprofits in the arts commit to essentially the liberation ideology, or whatever you want to call it, but they have to agree to to a form of diversity, equity, inclusion that that is pretty antithetical to what most of us think of as diversity, equity, inclusion. I mean, equity is the quality of being fair and impartial. There's nothing wrong with the word,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that the specific requirements that the foundations are making when they issue their grants are pushing a lot of nonprofit organizations in a direction that turns them into essentially factories for this ideology instead of actually fulfilling the mission that they were formed to fulfill.
So back then to the discussion around pulling this amazing group together, and if you go on the FAIR website, and some people here in this room are involved in the organization, talk a bit about how you went about gathering this group of people. And I want to be clear about something about why I'm pressing on the process questions,
Sure.
because I think your story is important, but I also want, for those in this room and the thousands that will probably be watching this on YouTube when we post it, to be a bit of a, if you will, a master class on how somebody moves from super concerned to a place where you have built an institution that is actively engaging in a cultural way on these issues. So the question then, how then did you go about, you saw these people, some connected to the Harpers Letter, some otherwise. How did you go about pulling them together to say, hey, I'm starting a new thing. You don't know who I am, but we're about this particular mission?
So it started, I think I connected with Barry after the Stop Being Shocked article. So we had a mutual friend who connected us. Then Barry connected me with Melissa Chen, Peter Boghossian, some other people. I think there had been various people who had talked about the need for a new institution. I'm a person who likes to get things done. So I saw the need to move forward with this. I had Barry and other people connected me with, I think Melissa knew Steven Pinker.
Mm-hmm.
Steven Pinker was on the board of Ideas Beyond Borders, which was a nonprofit that Melissa had started. And so I started asking people to be on the board of advisors for this new organization. I think what you'll find is once you have, I think, people who other people want to be associated with, then it becomes easier.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think the first 5 or 10 were a little bit harder. There were a lot of conversations with people. And in parallel with building the board of advisors, there's funding, right? So I started talking to donors who were interested in supporting what we were focused on. At the same time, started writing the mission statement, the manifesto, if you will. Ultimately, our mission is, I think, very clear, and 15 months into this, I feel even more strongly it's the right mission, and it's to advance civil rights and liberties, and promote a common culture based on fairness, understanding, and humanity. And this is because I think ultimately what we need is an institution that stands up for individual rights, right? Primarily rooted in the First and 14th Amendments of the Constitution, and also the cultural issues that we're dealing with, which have to do with fairness, understanding, and humanity, which are, related to Enlightenment values, right? So that was really the focus. So all this was happening in parallel, and at the same time, I've got my op-ed, which is waiting for my wife to give the okay for me to move forward with that, and so we coordinated a launch in March. We launched on March 4th, I believe, and then the op-ed came out a few days later. That was the start. I mean, at that point, it was all, a ragtag group of volunteers. I threw myself into this 100%. So I'm a full-time volunteer for FAIR, but, and the head of our legal network, Letitia Kim, is also a full-time volunteer. But, we have a number of paid staff as well. We have close to 17 people right now on staff, because, ultimately not everyone can drop everything and focus on something that they're passionate about and not earn an income. So that was really the process. And I think that, then just my startup experience and just all, every step of the way there, I think ultimately as an entrepreneur, you have to think about, how can you clear obstacles? How can you set realistic goals? How can you bring in the right people? And so over the past 15 months, that's, those are the steps that I've been following.
So just a quick note to say we'll have Q&A for this as well. So if you have questions you'd like me to weave in here, please let me know. One more process question, then I want to touch more on the cultural questions that you've touched on, you mentioned before. It's fair to say that, if you will, that FAIR has grown really beyond some of its, initially when FAIR first came onto my radar screen, it was this kind of NATO of kind of really great thinkers, artists, scholars, and so forth that was making this declaration essentially that we are supporting one another in this and we are here to defend your rights wherever you may be. But it has gone further only in the space of 15 months, much more into the education space, the legal space as well. So talk a little bit about, again, how your startup expertise was brought to bear in an organization that kind of started at one thing, but it seems to have grown organically, maybe beyond your original vision for where it might go, all in the space of 15 months.
So what I will say is it's grown in the direction that we wanted it to grow. So I think laying this out, one of the things that you want to do in a startup is have focus. And so this was actually a struggle for me, because what was clear to me is that we needed an organization, a platform, if you will, that was going to span multiple sectors. Because ultimately what we're dealing with is a set of issues that, let's just say really started in higher education, but have spread and metastasized, and I think are now throughout our culture. And so how do you fix that problem? You can't just fix it by focusing on one place. You have to actually address this in multiple places. And so the concept behind FAIR was to build a platform that can be leveraged in different sectors. So we have FAIR in medicine, we have FAIR in the arts, we have FAIR in education, and depending on which industry, we have more or less in terms of resources focused on that. So FAIR in education is focused on K through 12, and what we've done there is we've we have a small team of really passionate people who have put together, I would say, educational resources in K through 12, which are a better option than the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice option, right? In addition to that, we're developing an ethnic studies curriculum, which will meet the California ethnic studies requirements and is based on what we call a pro-human approach, right? So the pro-human approach is, fundamentally based on those values of fairness, understanding, humanity. And at its core, I think the concept there is, under humanity, is to see people as unique individuals, right? To see them as unique individuals, and also to emphasize our shared humanity, right? And so that I would contrast with the illiberal, dehumanizing approach of seeing people as interchangeable members of an identity group. And so having ethnic studies is not a bad thing, but ethnic studies based on the liberated model, based on seeing people as interchangeable members of identity groups that is ultimately dehumanizing, is a bad thing. And so what we're trying to do is offer constructive solutions that people can use. So because ultimately institutions need to adopt some of these things. I mean, there are corporations that have diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, they have training programs, et cetera. And so what we're doing is, across each of those areas, offering pro-human solutions that organizations can adopt.
And so in that, did those categories start off the way that you envisioned them, or have people kind of come to you to say, hey, I know you think this is just in education, but it's really also in medicine. You think it's just in medicine, it's really also in a corporate culture. How has that grown?
So we had a sense of where we needed to focus, but you can't do everything at the same time.
Right.
So what we did is we started with education. So we started focusing on K through 12. And then fair in medicine, I think we had a number of doctors who had approached us and who wanted to have fair as a platform for them. So we had fair in medicine next, and fair in the arts is the most recent effort. But I think ultimately you need this support within journalism. You need this support within government. You need it within technology. I think you need it across multiple sectors, because I think this ideology has really pervaded all aspects of our culture.
So let's go to that. You just touched on the cultural piece, which is this seeing people as parts of interchangeable identity groups as opposed to individuals.
Yeah.
But there's, as we've been exploring through the afternoon, there's also just the communications piece about this as well, about how we can express ourselves. And so talk a little, at once, this is both an ideology, but it's also an approach to dealing with difference in how we communicate. You talk quite a bit in your principles on the FAIR website about these principles of civility and open-mindedness, courage. Talk a bit about the, if you will, kind of the necessary squishy skills of discussing these difficult topics, and how those can be somehow promoted or inculcated into society.
So the principles that you're referring to, so we have 6 principles for peaceful change, which are modeled on Martin Luther King's principles of nonviolence, which are modeled on people who came before Martin Luther King. But I think at its core, what we're trying to do is to bring a positive, constructive approach to a real problem, right? To a real issue. I think there are a lot of people who react to this sort of ideology when they encounter it and become angry, and they become hateful is what I've actually seen. And so what we're trying to do is help people meet hate with love. I think ultimately there are forces of hate and forces of love in the world, and we are focused on bringing more love into the world. So I know that may sound kumbaya and squishy, but I think it's actually really important that that when you're encountering a dehumanizing approach, something that really undermines that core concept of what it means to be human, right? Who wants to be viewed as a representative of an identity group? Every person is unique. Every person has value. That's important. That resonates with people. So I think that's something that we're really focused on advancing, I would say, positive values. And I think also tactically, it's much more effective. I think if you actually want to influence institutions, if you want to influence organizations, to come in a constructive way. So we've had success with large corporations that want to work with FAIR to bring the pro-human approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So based on our core principles, they want to work with us. And if you take a more negative, pessimistic, aggressive approach, then I think you turn people off. So I think tactically it's more effective, but I also think ultimately that's what we're trying to create, right? I think that we want a world where love is centered, not hate.
Well, I'm happy to go into the kumbaya moment because in part, that obviously this is happening, that you're not coming from a place of confrontation, which is necessary because the institutions you are seeking to engage, if not reform, are the ones in the power position. At the same time, as we've seen, there can be opportunities for, just look at what you've done. You've started as an individual who has seen something wrong in your view that needed to be righted, and has created an institution that is seeking to influence. That institution has gained credibility, legitimacy, and, if you will, some degree of power because of the people who have sought to affiliate with it. So when somebody who doesn't know who FAIR is gets a call from FAIR, they then look at your website and then find out, oh, okay, so this isn't just some kumbaya guy. This is somebody that's actually got some people that are behind it and supportive of it. So a couple of the questions here talk about the programs that are already in place, whether they are the DEI programs or the California Ethnic Studies curriculum, which is something I have some familiarity with. That curriculum, as you well know, has been a source of great polarization, usually among the activist groups, although I think it shocks some people to know that when the ethnic studies curriculum was first released in the summer of 2019, the LA Times came out against it, saying that it was too ideological. Governor Newsom at the time stepped in to basically tell the people who were involved to go back to the drawing board. So how are you picking the organizations or initiatives that you're engaging with? Are you called in, or do you see a story like the California Ethnic Studies curriculum, which has continued to go through a number of revisions, and say, this is something that we think we can bring some value to?
In terms of how we identify them, we have our chapter network. So we have people across the country, I think we're in 40 states, who will bring issues to us. We have a rubric that we're using to just to evaluate different issues that we could take on, and the rubric ties back to our mission, right? And I think that's important. So so if it's a First Amendment or a 14th Amendment issue, then that gets top of the list. But then we also look at how this issue impacts the cultural values that we're trying to advance, the principles we're trying to advance, so fairness, understanding, and humanity. So it's and then we would prioritize based on how
Bandwidth and
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but at this point, it's been I think there are issues that are emerging. I think a lot of the issues around gender, for example, I think that's something that one of the things that we're trying to do is avoid letting things that are best handled through the political process, we actually don't want to take on. So I think that there are some aspects of gender issues, for example, that we are taking on, right? So the teaching to very young children using what's called the genderbread person. I don't know if anyone who has children is probably familiar with this. Even my kid's new school actually brought a consultant in who at the beginning of a sex ed class for my 5th grade daughter put up the genderbread person. And what the genderbread person shows is a picture of a gingerbread man, but they are showing a spectrum for sex, right? That it's male, female, or somewhere in between, for gender identity and for gender expression. And fundamentally, that's something that is harmful to children, and within our framework, one of the things that we're addressing is essentialism, right? So this idea of flattening people, stereotyping people. So so that's something that ultimately you're teaching a young child that if they deviate from a gender stereotype, they are probably in the wrong body, and so you're planting a seed that can actually be harmful to that child. And it's the same issue that we would have with race essentialism, where you're telling somebody, if you have this much melanin in your skin, then you're a star belly sneetch, and if you have this much melanin in your skin, you're a plain belly sneetch. I mean, that's the basic concept of essentialism and flattening people into stereotypes. Other issues, that where it's more of a political question, we want to stay away from. And I think what we want to avoid is the mistake that the ACLU has made, which is it's become a political organization. And so I think it's important, it's just as important, I think, to define what you're not going to do as defining what you are going to do.
So just kind of on that note, and to this discussion between principles of communication versus the actual content of what is being taught. Question here from someone who's seen your website and materials. It said the group mission states to, quote, defeat injustice, not people, to, quote, seek to defeat evil, not people. How do we best do this when it is indeed people who carry out the directives of evil? Is that goal too aspirational in practice? Is it too difficult? I mean, fact of the matter is, whether you had to or felt you needed to, you uprooted your family and life to leave where you were with your original goal of having at least your daughter make it through all the way through the school. Your wife was foresighted enough to know that there was going to be some negative blowback from the course that you decided to take. How do you deal with that?
What was the question?
How do we do best? How do we do this best when it is indeed people who carry out evil, to seek to defeat evil, not people?
Okay, so I think it comes back to the basic concept of disconnecting the ideas from the person. I think that there are people, I think generally speaking, most people think that they are doing good. I actually do believe that. And I think that people who are perpetrating evil often think that they are doing good. Not always, but often. And so I think if you, and I also think that it's important to be open-minded yourself as you're entering into a conversation, right? And to not assume things about other people. I think ultimately, if you have that approach, you will be much more impactful, and I think you will advance the principles that we're trying to advance. What I've found is that there are institutions that may be doing things that are illiberal, but when you actually stop and you talk to the individuals within that institution, those individuals are not necessarily proponents of those illiberal actions. And so I think if you can approach each person with an open mind and have a conversation and not rush to judgment, then I think you will be more impactful and advance the principles that we're trying to advance. I think if you look at people in a black and white, good and evil way, then I think you actually become part of the problem.
A couple of questions here on the role of timing. Mm-hmm. It's fair to say, at least some of my experiences, both with parents of kids in elementary through high school, as well as parents of kids in higher education, that COVID completely changed the game on what parents knew about what was going on inside the classrooms. Mm-hmm. Your response as an organization that has been responding to this, how has COVID influenced the work that you do, or the calls that you get as parents get a clearer sense, maybe that for the first time, certainly some of this may be the new content that's coming into the curriculum, but some of this also seems to be meeting at a new awareness, or what I call an awakening to the awakening that mm-hmm. is happening.
Right.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the timing.
So I do think I think COVID affected this in multiple ways. I think one way, obviously, is as a parent, I had much more visibility into what was happening in the classroom. So, just as an example, right at the start of the school year, school assembly is on Zoom. I'm watching, and I see that the head of the lower school kicks things off with a video where he has somebody dressed as the school mascot telling these young children, these are ages 5 to 11, to check each other's words and actions. And I immediately think, oh my gosh, why would you be telling young children to check each other's? That's the opposite of what I want to tell them to do. And so I think I wouldn't have had visibility into that if we were not able to watch what was happening on Zoom. So I do think that had something to do with the growing awareness of the Great Awakening. But I think I think COVID also accelerated the shift toward this ideology, which had been on campus for probably decades and growing in strength. I think it emboldened, I think, many of the school administrators, in particular, I think in private schools. I actually think that the National Association of Independent Schools and many of the independent schools in the country, which are a small percentage of students, but it's a large percentage of the educated elite in the country. So I think it's very impactful. But I think a lot of these schools really just radically shifted, and I think the administrators were in place. They were incrementally putting some of these policies in place, but I think ultimately COVID, the shutdown, the lockdown, emboldened many of the schools to roll out these policies much more quickly, much more aggressively.
So just a couple more questions. When you'd mentioned that much of the impetus and the foundation for the work you do is based on Enlightenment philosophy. One of the questions here goes to the importance or the influence of Judeo-Christian beliefs as well in this. I think about the Jewish commendations around regarding to the foreigner or the outsider. Certainly in Scripture, in the Christian faith, there is a belief and phrasing around there is neither Jew nor Greek, Scythian nor free, slave nor free, that we are all one in Christ. Talk a bit about, are there organizations that are coming alongside from a more, certainly understanding the importance of Enlightenment thought, but also from, you're sending your kids to a Jewish day school, the importance of people of faith getting involved in this and bringing that faith perspective into these discussions around the importance of the individual.
100%. I think that and I would say that's our humanity pillar is probably, I don't know that that's rooted in Enlightenment values, to tell you the truth. That's probably more rooted in faith. But I think it's a fairly universal concept across, not just Judeo-Christian, but I think almost any faith tradition. And I think, frankly, healthy secular philosophies as well. So I think that, what we find is that, we have people who are Mormon, people who are Christian, from various denominations, people who are Catholic, people who are Jewish, all people who are atheists, right? All of who are, can appreciate these core values. Because I think ultimately these values are central to, I think, any healthy functioning society. And I think that's really what we're up against, this, liberation ideology, this, reductionist, dehumanizing approach is ultimately anti-human. I think that it's not compatible with a healthy functioning society. And so I think, the widespread adoption of this ideology is going to be catastrophic to any society that lets it happen. I will say I am incredibly optimistic at the same time, because I don't think that I don't think it has been adopted in a widespread way. I think the institutions have been captive to a relatively small number of, very illiberal, radical activists. But I think that now that there's an awareness, a growing awareness, I think that is starting to unravel, and I think that, so I'm incredibly encouraged, but I don't think it's going to happen on its own, so I think that people do need to be aware, they need to get involved, but I don't think that worst case scenario will happen, because I think that too many people are seeing what's happening and are now speaking up and getting involved.
I think that's a great note to end on. Please join me in thanking Bion Bartning. Well, that will take us to the end of what I hope you found to be an enlightening, encouraging, and disturbing series of conversations. It began with Dr. George's important and foundational talk. And again, I want to thank Howard and David Amundsen and Fieldstead for supporting this work. As we always say at the end of our events, an important part, in fact, the larger audience for the work that we've done today, the conversations that we've hosted, will be, ironically, online. And so all of you who have registered will be getting a link to the videos as they are posted. And I only ask that you share them with your networks. I wouldn't be surprised, in thinking about the networks we're all involved in different ways, that the group, even here, that is represented in this room is connected to 5,000 or 10,000 people, if not more. And so the opportunity that you have to pass around the work that's being done by people like Bion, the message of Dr. George, the discussions that we've had about what's happening on the internet and big tech, certainly in the journalistic media, as well as in academia, are ones that I think are very worth sharing. So for the panelists that are here, thank you so much for contributing to some great conversations. Again, I am very grateful, not only to supporters like the Amundsons, but also to a place like Pepperdine and the School of Public Policy, which is committed to these principles, and in a way that allows and gives me the freedom to be able to organize events like this and ones to come. This, again, is our 25th anniversary year. And so if you want to find out more about the events that we have planned, please make sure that you touch base with either with me or Melissa, and we'll make sure that you're on the email list for upcoming events. We are now adjourned, but the party doesn't stop. It actually starts. So we are going to gather just up about a 10-minute drive up PCH to a place called Spruzzo's. We've got a great spread laid out for you, and hope that you can all join us, speak with our panelists and speakers who are here, and just debrief and decompress from what I think was a great series of conversations.